It's great when you have the privilege of meeting old people who give a good example. I remember once when I was doing Legion of Mary work, I had the privilege of going with a lady who was so sweet and so apostolic and such a good example. I remember my parish priest, I was in the Legion of Mary. I remember we were doing door-to-door work, and at one time, there were some people who were actually complaining. They were saying, how is it this young person, I might have been like 14 years old, how is it that he's going door to door? He's not up for it. And my parish priest came to my defense and says, no, he's well able. And he defended me. And I remember it was such a privilege because I was going with this lady who was probably maybe 60, maybe 70 years old, maybe. I don't think of her as that old. I really thought of her as like a great companion. And I remember how enjoyable it was for me just to be around her. I remember we'd go door to door. Sometimes we would pray the rosary. She was so humble. She would always follow my lead. So I said, do you want to pray the rosary? She'd say, of course I'd love to pray the rosary. What better thing we'd do? If I wanted to talk, she's like, oh, it's so great to talk to you. She was always like so joyful. And I remember as well, she would always let me talk. She wouldn't like interrupt me when I was talking, when we were doing the door-to-door visits. I was like maybe 15 years old. I wasn't that old. But she was, her example to me was excellent. I remember finding out later that she was actually the one who drove around Mother Teresa of Calcutta when she was in the Washington, D.C. area, which was a lot. She was there many times. But I remember her example for me was the example of someone who was old age, who had an old age, but she still had virtue. Like she still had a youthful spirit. She would always go like walk at my pace. It was just such an example. Just such a good example. Today in the readings, there's a phrase of Eleazar, which I think is fascinating. There's a moment, just to give a little bit of the context, there's a moment where there's the persecution of the Jews, and he's being asked to eat meat, which as Catholics, like to eat like a piece of pork is, we've already we're past that. That's not one of the issues. If you don't accept the first council of the church in Acts 15, it is an issue. Like if you don't accept that, then you can't eat pork. It's like today we eat pork, for instance. So if you don't accept the first council of the church, you can't eat pork. I mean, yeah, if you're a Jew, there's no way you can do that unless you have the first council, Acts chapter 15. But the interesting thing with Eleazar is that as he should, like a Jew who doesn't have that step of Christianity made by Christ, led by Christ, if that step hasn't been taken, you should die rather than eat pork. That should be your attitude. In other words, if I'm not convinced about Acts chapter 15, I should die rather than eat it. It's pretty impressive to think about. And Eleazar was right. He insisted not only, this is the detail I'm getting at, not only did he insist on not eating the pork, he insisted on not faking that he was eating pork. In other words, what we just read in 2 Maccabees 6 is that he had a friend who came up to him and took him aside and said, look, you don't have to eat pork. We're good friends. I'll give you get your own meat, you get whatever meat you want. You can even get some of that fake protein, that, like that vegetable stuff that you mix with water and it tastes like meat. It can even taste like pork, but it's not actually pork. I'm saying this because I'm here with Javi Samino, and today, in the last few days, we've been using like this fake meat stuff that we were given. It tastes a lot like meat. It even has like the texture of meat. And there's no meat in it. It's really weird. These are the effects of poverty on young men. Anyway, so he could have like had one of those like fake pork. It could even have like looked kind of pinkish. He could have eaten that. And would it have been a sin? You could say, okay, objectively, it wouldn't have been a sin, but it would have been a sin. Why? Because it was a bad example for the young people. And that's what he says. He says it would a pretense to do a bad example to the youth. In other words, as Catholics, we know, as it says, even the Catechism of the Catholic Church, you should never do evil or give the impression that you're doing evil. Both things are important. In other words, if something scandalizes someone, in other words, if someone seeing you thinks that you're sinning, you should correct him and tell him you're not doing what he thinks you're doing. In other words, you shouldn't lead with a bad example. And this is precisely what this lady was doing. She was giving me a good example. She was giving me a good example in her old age. And for me, if I were to see her doing something which was sinful, it would have been a scandal. It would have been something which would have hurt would have hurt me as a young man. She didn't. She was a great example. Through and through. She was excellent. But it's important also to recognize, and this is something that can happen also for those who are older, we can sin by scandal. In other words, when somebody asks us, what were you doing the other day? We might be tempted to say, oh, I went for a stroll. Instead of saying that we went to Mass on Sunday. In other words, someone can be they might go to Mass, but they don't tell others that they're actually going to Mass. This happens. This happens. You're with the friends, and where are you? Oh, I don't know. I had a good weekend. I was with some friends. But they don't tell that they were at a Youth 2000 retreat and there was a lot of fun because they're ashamed. So it's an example of being ashamed. And Christ says it in the gospel as well. He says that phrase was, whoever is ashamed of me in this wicked and perverse generation, I will be ashamed of him before my Father and his holy angels. Yeah, that's a scary quote. I think it's Mark 8:38. And it's one to keep in mind. But it's important that we also, and this is good because as members, those who are members of the Home of the Mother, we have as our third mission the conquest of the young people for Christ. And the first way to conquer them is by our good example. There's a phrase of Socrates, which I find fascinating. He says how there's a moment when he's on trial for perverting the youth. That's what they accused him of. And he comes out with this phrase. It's genius. He says, tell me. He's sitting there about to be killed. He says, tell me, who is it that does good to young people? Oh, no, he says, who is it that does good to horses? Those who know about horses or those who don't know how to treat horses? The answer, obviously, is the person who does good to the horse is the person who knows what the horse needs. The one who has worked with horses, the one who loves the horses and cares about the horses and knows what they should, could, can, and ought to be doing. Same thing with the young people. Same thing with those who have already lived a life of virtue. They're supposed to be the ones to transmit. Those who know what it is how to live a good life are the ones who are supposed to do good to the young people. In other words, the longer we have lived, the more obligation we have to do good to the young people, to be a good example. I'm thinking also of so many grandmothers. Here in Ireland, there are very holy grandmothers who, as they grow older, they're not supposed to become worse. They're supposed to become better. It's a great example. I want to give an example from Spain, and with this I'll end. There's an example of a lady who was going to Sunday Mass, and she was going afterwards to the party after the Mass. She would go to the family get-together, the family gathering, and she would always go with her Sunday best. Why? Because she had just come from Mass. One day, she decided not to. They would always complain about her wearing it, so she decided, I'm just gonna dress like everybody else. I'm gonna change before going to the event. She regretted it. She saw that they were happy and giddy, but they didn't think about God. They didn't talk about God. There was a peace, a happiness, which was bad. And she, like Eleazar, said, I'm going to dress the way I dressed before. It wasn't because she was trying to make war. It wasn't because she was trying to be mean. She was trying to be archaic or medieval, She was doing it because she loved the young people. And she wanted them because the young people asked her, what were you today? You didn't go to Mass today. We heard that you didn't go to Mass today. She said, I did go to Mass. And she thought to herself, and next time, I'll show it by the way I dress. We can ask the Blessed Virgin Mary, who among the apostles would have been the old lady of the group. She would have been older, And she lived in such a way to give a good example. St. Polycarp as well, he says when he was 86 years old and they were asking him also to renounce the faith, not to eat pork because that wasn't the issue, to renounce the faith, he says, I have served God for 86 years, and every year I have only received good things from him. How can I betray him when I'm 86? So we ask the Lord and the Blessed Mother, who is always faithful, the grace to also be faithful in old age. Amen.